Hi, and welcome to part 2 in a 3-part webinar series on goal setting and project management. In part 1, we talked about the fact that these skills are especially important right now as we think about going back and restarting research after the shutdown, but we also talked about the fact that they're really essential skills to have as researchers all of the time. And so if you missed part 1 in this series, I really encourage you to go back and watch that before you dive into part 2. Trust me, it will be worth it. For those of you who did catch part 1, if you remember, we talked about setting goals, and we talked about the things you need to know, the questions you need to answer as you set a goal. And we compared this to going out and driving somewhere. If you think about it, when you want to get somewhere, there's a series of things you need to know first. You need to know where you want to go, and you also need to know what is the best route. And it's usually really helpful to know how long it's going to take to get there. And in the case of driving, this is fortunately quite an easy thing to tackle thanks to the technology that we have these days. You can just throw this into your Google Map and you can figure out what is the best route and how long it's going to take to get there. It might not be quite as easy to do this with the projects, not nearly as easy to do this with the projects that you have in your research lab. However, I hope to show you that you can be just as systematic with this process as you can with thinking about driving somewhere. And if you remember, we also talked about the fact that these questions are really important to address, but there's an even much more important question to ask before you even get in your car, and that is why? Why do you want to go to that place? Or in the case of your research, why do you want to set that goal? And so when we look at the 3 questions that you need to ask your goals, the first one we need to tackle is this most important question of why. And that's why I put that in part 1 of the series. And we talked about the 2 different why questions that you really owe it to yourself to answer. The first of these being the slightly easier and more short-term why of why are you doing each of your projects? Or why are you trying to get each of your papers that you're working towards? And we talked about the fact that, most projects start out with one of these first 2 bullet points. Either you're trying to address an unmet need, or you're trying to explore an unanswered question. You're trying to do something that we can't currently do, or figure something out that we don't currently know. We also talked about the fact that while most projects start in one of these 2 categories, and that's great, they should, most projects end up in this 3rd category. Things don't work out quite as well as you wanted. You realize you're not going to be able to invent that transformative technology that you hope for, or you're not going to quite get to the answer of the big question you wanted to address. But there is still merit in doing what you're doing because it could give you a publication, and that will help you get where you want to go in your career. And on top of that, it's likely still going to share some very valuable information with your scientific field. We also addressed this bigger question of why are you even doing what you're doing? Why do you show up to work every day, really? And that might be that you love the job you have now, but then why do you love the job you have now? And if you don't love the job you have now, then why do you show up to it? Because it's helping you get to some other future career. And why are you so excited about that future career? And if you remember, the big conclusion from all of this is that there's a lot of answers to both of these questions. And there really are no wrong answers here, except for the one where you're not honest with yourself. If you can at least be honest about why you want to do your project and why you're showing up to work, that's going to give you all of the strategy and motivation that you need to be effective. And so today I want to tackle this second question, which is what is the best strategy? What's the best pathway to be successful in accomplishing that project and accomplishing it as efficiently as possible? And a quote I love for this is that a goal without a plan is just a wish. So if you want to achieve your goal, what you really need is a good plan. And the good news is that there's a really well-established field called project management that can help us figure out how to do this. The bad news in this is that unless you've ever wandered over to the business school at your university, Probably nobody has ever sat you down and just taught you the skill. I know nobody ever taught me this skill. And so it's just something that I had to learn along the way. And I'm still far from an expert in it. But what I hope to share in the next few minutes is some thoughts and some frameworks to at least get you started in thinking about how you manage your own projects. So if you're like me, when you started your first research project, you knew what the first experiment you wanted to do was, and you knew that at the end of all of it, you really hoped to be able to publish something, but everything in between that first experiment and that publication was still a little bit of a mystery. And I set out on my first project just thinking, well, I'll do that first experiment, I'll see where that takes me, and then I'll figure out the next step as I go along. I pretty quickly realized that that wasn't going to be an effective way to get my project done. And then I really needed something better than this framework. So the next thing I started doing was this. I could at least sit down, look at what I wanted to publish, outline that, think about what are all the experiments that I need to do. Ideally, if things all work well, we all know that things rarely go as planned, but at least, again, you should start out for a plan for what you're going to do if things go well, and even as we'll see, a plan for when things don't go well. But I could lay out all of these different experiments, and then I would just put them in order and say, well, I'll do the first one, and then the second one, and then the third one, and then eventually I'll get to a publication. But again, I pretty quickly found that this was still not getting me to the level of efficiency that I really wanted to be at with being able to execute on my projects. And the reason why is that much like the where you want to go and those questions you ask of, well, where do I want to go? What's the best way? And how long will it take to get there? There was a much, much more important question that I should have been asking before I even got to experiment one. And that was this question of, what will I have to do to make this fail, right? Nobody wants their project to fail, but you can't control that. The only thing you can control really is how fast you make it fail. And trust me, you want to make it fail as fast as possible. If something isn't going to work out, you want to find that out sooner rather than later so you can move on to something else. This is one of those tricky things though, because despite the fact that it is clearly better to find out sooner rather than later, everything in us will resist this and try to put off that experiment that's going to make it fail because we worry we won't have a backup plan. But trust me, you'll have more project ideas. You can definitely afford to change your project and pivot to a new idea. What you might not be able to afford to do is spend years and years on something that is never going to work out in the first place. And so when you start a project, again, the only wrong answers are the ones where you are not honest with yourself. So be candid with yourself about everything that might fail. What things do you already know? And what techniques are really new and high risk? A super important one is to think about what I call the challenging physical realities. These are things like binding affinities or reaction kinetics or just chemical reactivity in our field. If you're trying to develop a sensor for something and probably the best binding affinity you can get is in the micromolar range, but the challenging physical reality of both that and the fact that the thing you need to sense in order to actually have a useful technology is several orders of magnitude lower in concentration. That's something that in the long term is very likely to make your project fail, at least as you envisioned it. However, if you know that up front, you can make a decision and say, I probably won't get to the point that this technology is the absolutely best way to sense this target. However, maybe there's still something to be gained. Maybe I can still get a publication from it, or maybe I can still contribute some technology to the field. So again, you can pivot your project to a different why, but only if you're actually honest with yourself. And finally, you have to be very honest about where you're going to have to invest time before knowing whether or not you're even going to be able to get a publication out of this. And so again, asking yourself, how can you tackle these things before anything else? Even though that is the absolute hardest thing to do, it's what's going to make you most successful in the end. And it's okay, because if something doesn't go as you plan, it might not be a deal breaker. It might just change why you're doing the project, And again, that is useful information to have. The sooner you know that, the sooner you can change the amount of time commitment you put on the project or make other pivots in the project that then work best with that why that you're now operating under. Or occasionally it is time to move on. You find something that means that this project is just absolutely not going to work. And that is something that you definitely want to know sooner rather than later. And so as you think about, now coming back to this project management chart, a slightly better option might look like this, where now you have some sort of a feasibility test, all those experiments, all those things that might make your project fail. Think about an experiment that you can do to test whether or not those are in fact going to be problematic. And then put that as the absolute first thing that you do. And again, a not great answer on that experiment might not kill the whole project, but it's probably going to shape everything that follows in some really important ways. And so as we look at this, we're definitely getting to something that's better. But I would argue that this is still not ideal, because even once you get through these feasibility tests, you're still taking these experiments just one at a time. And even what is in that feasibility test box, it's probably a lot of different experiments. And so how do you even approach those? And so as we think about taking an even deeper dive into how to plan your project, we see that we need to address both all of the complexity in these feasibility tests and also the most efficient way to do all of the experiments that follow. And so for all of those experiments that are testing whether your project might fail, take a look at those and ask yourself which are most important. Which ones hinge on the success of others? Is there a certain order that you need to attack these in? And which ones are deal breakers where if it doesn't work out, you're going to pivot to a whole new project versus plan changers, where you probably would still want to stick with that project, but you'd either want to change how you do the project or why you're doing the project in the first place. So you can sort all of that out, and then you can move on to the actual experiments that need to be done. So once you've convinced yourself that this project is feasible, that it will likely be able to get you to a publication, now take a look at all of the experiments that need to be done. And again, ask yourself, which ones are most important? Which things absolutely need to be in a publication? Among those, which ones can be done in parallel at the same time? And which ones have to be done in sequence, where you have to gather data from one experiment before you can move on to the next one? And think about which ones require wait time, where you're going to have to maybe prepare some samples or run an experiment and then send it off to a core facility or to a company and then wait for weeks or maybe even months before you get your data back, and where you're going to have really a large downtime that you're going to need to fill. And also, which are the really important experiments, but that you could envision multiple different options for how you could approach completing them. And once you have all of that laid out, think about how you can arrange all of these things to really maximize your efficiency as you complete the project. And the key here is that there's no one best answer, just as I could look at my map for driving to work and it's a little bit tough to predict. Even if my map tells me how long each route is going to take, there might be an accident or traffic might change. And so again, you're making your best guess, but at least you're making an educated guess. And also, like with driving, your plan may change partway through. You may run into an unanticipated roadblock, literally or figuratively, that makes you have to change your course. And that's okay. But again, you want to always have a plan. And once you have a plan, you can modify from there. And so if we look at where we left off, we had our feasibility test and then all these different experiments. But an even better model for this is something like what's on the right-hand side of the screen here, where now you realize you have two really, really important feasibility tests, and you have a third one. You can't do the third one until you do the first two. So you're going to do those two, and then move on to the third one. And then only if those are successful are you going to move on to the rest of your experiments. But even here, we look at how we can maximize the efficiency of getting these experiments done. You might look out and say, well, experiment 1 is the first thing that I'll talk about in the paper, but experiment 2 is something that I can do in parallel with that. It's not dependent on experiment 1. And experiment 2 is something that's going to have this really significant wait time to it, where I have to do some stuff, and then I'm just gonna have to wait on someone else to analyze my data or get me a sample back before I can move forward. So if it were me doing project management, I would say, well, let's put experiment 2 before anything else. Let's kind of get that into the mix and get that rolling, because then you'll have this wait time. And during that wait time, you can start to tackle experiment 1. And I might say, you know, that experiment 2, if it has a big wait time, if it doesn't come back good, if the data don't look good or you don't get the result you want, that's going to really set you back. And so if there's an alternative experiment 2, a different way that you could get at those data or accomplish that goal, I might think, you know, if that's not too hard to do, it might even be worth starting on early, just in case, as a backup plan. Again, you want to always think about how much time would I have to put into that? How much time would it save me if I needed it? And honestly, how likely is it that experiment 2 is going to fail? If experiment 2 is low risk, just push ahead. If experiment 2 is very high risk and you're going to lose a lot of time if it fails, it might really be worth having that alternate experiment in parallel. And you can even think about things like bonus experiments. Often we save these. These are the things that don't have to be in your paper, but they make your paper that much cooler. Again, we usually save those for the very end. You do all the essential things, and then you say, boy, it'd be really cool if we could do these other things as well. But again, if you have some project management skills and you're thinking ahead and making a plan, you can recognize where you're going to have that wait time. And if that bonus experiment is, again, something you can do in parallel, as they often are, then you can even plug that in during that wait time. And now you've got this cool extra piece of data that's there when you need it, when you're ready to publish. And so this is my approach, but this is a pretty personal process, and everyone has different models that they prefer. So as you work through the homework, I want to encourage you to not stick too rigidly to how I've mapped this out, and even experiment with different ways of thinking about this to figure out what works best for you. And so looking at this homework, think about your top priority project for when you get back to lab, or if you're back in lab, think about your top priority project right now. We'll do it for that project first, but then you can even go back and iterate this process for every project you have. And for bonus points, you can even take all of the projects you have and map them out and integrate experiments from different projects into this flowchart diagram of your time and be even more efficient by working on multiple projects in parallel and doing so in a really mindful, planned out way. And so to do this for a single project, first outline, what have you completed up until now? What are all of the preliminary experiments, which are feasibility experiments, and which are just these key experiments that get you towards the project? You can either do this with words, or I like to do this with figures. So draw out the figures or even make the figures that are going to go in your manuscript. And then do the exact same thing for all of the experiments that you still need to do to publish, and any bonus experiments that aren't essential for publication, but you'd really like to give a try. Again, you can do this with either words or drawing figures. Draw out what you at least expect your data to look like. They may not look like that, but you can draw out what you're aiming for so that you know where you want to go. And then this one's super important. Again, the hardest thing probably on this list is identify anything that's still out there that could make your project fail, and categorize each of these. Is it a deal breaker or is it a plan changer? And then think about all of the different ways, just like a puzzle. What are all of the different ways that you could arrange these tasks? Maybe the only rule is that the feasibility experiments should come first. And then beyond that, play around with how things map out with wait time, what goes in parallel, what has to be done in sequence, where you might be able to sneak one of those fun bonus experiments in, and at least choose an approach that you think is best. And recognize you can always change this. Actually set it even in your schedule to revisit this every week, or a couple of weeks, or every month, and ask yourself, is this still the best way possible for this project? And something I didn't talk about, but you can definitely do, and it's going to be especially important right now, as so many of us are working in shorter shifts because of lab occupancy requirements. Think about taking all of this process and boiling it down to a smaller scale. of just an individual day. What are the experiments that need to be done in sequence? What can be done in parallel? What requires wait time? And where can you slot experiments into those wait times to be as efficient as possible? And take a moment and just outline what your first 2 shifts might look like when you go back, assuming that you have all of the reagents that you need. These aren't super easy skills to build at first, but over time, you can get to a point where you do this almost intuitively. And trust me, it is going to pay off big time. And so before you go, I encourage you to stay tuned for part 3 of this series. So we've just talked about how to do things as quickly and efficiently as possible. But in part 3, we're going to dive into the question of, can I plan out ahead of time? Can I calculate out how long it might still reasonably take? And I promise that the answer I'll give you is at least more useful than wishful thinking. Thanks for joining.